Right now, I want to bring in MS Now legal affairs reporter Fallon Gallagher from outside the Supreme Court. Jake Traylor is covering the White House. Henrietta Treyz is co-founder and director of economic policy at Vita Partners. Jeffrey Rosen is a law professor at George Washington University. And with me in studio, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin. Fallon, just run through this for us. What does this ruling say?
Yeah, Laura, this is a massive blow to the president for his signature agenda item from a conservative-leaning court that has typically been very sympathetic to the president and his agenda. In this ruling, this Supreme Court has found that IEEPA, that law that the president used to enact 5 categories of his sweeping tariffs, is unconstitutional for tariffs. That is that the Congress has not given the president this authority to use that law, IEEPA.
What's up, folks? Dr. John Podcast is back. So what just happened, guys? Trump isn't just raging about unfair rulings anymore. He's running a sustained, deliberate campaign to convince Americans that federal judges who rule against him aren't just wrong. They're criminals who need to be punished. Not with dramatic courthouse arrests, but with something more insidious. 2
invoked tariffs, and I want to read very briefly from Justice Roberts' majority opinion. He writes, IEEPA's grant of authority to, quote, regulate importation falls short. IEEPA contains no reference to tariffs or duties. The government points to no statute in which Congress used the word regulate to authorize taxation. And until now, no president has read IEEPA to confer such power. And I was inside court for oral arguments, and much of the discussion and debate surrounded on that word regulate and whether regulate meant tariff. Now, the justices here have found that it does not, that is a power that is reserved for Congress, and that the president does not have the authority to use this specific statute to impose his tariffs. But notably also in this decision, it's written by Justice Roberts. That's not entirely surprising because the Chief Justice, when he sides with the majority, will typically write the opinion for these consequential cases. But notably, 3 of the typically conservative-leaning justices are in the majority here. You see Roberts, you also see Justice Gorsuch and Justice Barrett, who are here siding against the president in this very significant case. Laura?
Legislation designed to criminalize judicial independence, public intimidation campaigns, and a systematic effort to delegitimize the only branch of government with the constitutional authority to tell a president no. The line between executive and judicial power is invisible but absolute, and he's decided it no longer applies to him.
Fallon, thank you for that. And we just have some news from the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, who said that President Trump will hold a press briefing on the Supreme Court's tariffs decision at 12:45 p.m. Eastern today. Jake, what are we hearing from the president so far from the White House?
Yeah, Laura, she dropped that literally at noon on the dot. She was teeing it up for your show, I guess. So we will hear from the president for the first time at 12:45, unless we get a Truth Social post first. This is sometimes how it goes, but it was a bit notable that when this decision came down, the president was actively in a meeting, a bipartisan meeting with governors at the White House. And a White House official that was in the room tells me that a note was brought in, given to the president. This is when the press had already been escorted out, so there were no cameras capturing this in the moment. The president read that the SCOTUS decision had been made, not in his favor. He then addressed the governors directly and said, quote, it's disgraceful what the courts have done. That was according again to a White House official who was in the room for that moment. In terms of other things that are happening internally at the White House right now.
Let me pull back the curtain on this because the timeline of events is critical and the connective tissue between them is what most mainstream coverage is failing to stitch together. The story accelerates in that period when the calendar pages turn and the chill of late-season political battles fills the air. The president standing before a gathering of Republican lawmakers.
Another White House official tells me that obviously at this point the West Wing is very aware. For a long time now, the president as well as other senior officials have been teeing up that they have some way to counteract a decision of this sort happening. Another White House official told me that they are unsurprised by this decision and that this is something they planned for a long time. What we lack at the moment are actual substantive details of how they intend to counteract this SCOTUS ruling. The president, as early as last night, railed against the Supreme Court, saying he had been waiting time after time for a ruling to come down. Take a listen to that.
I've been waiting forever. And the language is clear that I have the right to do it as president. I have the right to put tariffs on for national security purposes, countries that have been ripping us off for years. You know what they were doing? Using tariffs. What a country. So sad.
Laura, as you can tell, the president pretty fired up right there in that moment. A couple of big questions, of course, right now are, one, what happens to all of the money that companies have already paid due to the current tariff ruling that exists before the ruling came down today? And then secondly, of course, as the White House keeps saying they have a plan, which we know they say a lot of times, they've been working on something to counteract. What are the specific details of that? Hopefully this press conference in just the hour will give us some new detail there.
Launched into a tirade that, had it been delivered by any previous occupant of the Oval Office, would have triggered a constitutional 5-alarm fire that burned across every front page in the country. He looked at the members of his own party and demanded a new crime bill, not a bill aimed at the fentanyl traffickers poisoning communities, not a bill aimed at the violent repeat offenders who make city streets feel like war zones. No, this bill had a very specific, very targeted, and very unprecedented target. The target was federal judges.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions about that, too, that Jeffrey, I'm going to go to you in just a moment. But first, Lisa, I want to come to you here. What stuck out to you about this decision?
There are a bunch of things that stuck out to me. Let's start with the thing that struck both Fallon and I alike. Across 170 pages, Laura, there are 7 different opinions written by the 9 members of the court. That means that while 6 justices got to the result that IEEPA, the statute on which the president was relying, doesn't authorize him to impose the tariffs at issue, they got there in different ways. Think about it as like a choose-your-own-adventure book. It all has the same ending, but what happens in the middle for some of these justices is quite different. The other thing that struck me about it is it's a victory not only for the plaintiffs who brought the case, but for Congress as a whole, even if some Republican members of Congress don't see it that way. If you read Justice Roberts's...
His words were not ambiguous. He called them rogue. He called their decisions dangerous and wrong. And then he used the word that should make every American who believes in the separation of powers sit bolt upright in their chair: criminals. He told the assembled members of Congress that these judges are criminals and that they need to be cracked down on. He wasn't invoking the constitutional remedy of impeachment, a process that exists precisely for removing judges who commit high crimes and misdemeanors.
Opinion for the court, you read Justice Gorsuch's concurrence, you see them basically say, the power to regulate importation, which was the phrase at issue here, isn't one where we know exactly what it means, but here's what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean the power to tax. That is a power that is reserved constitutionally to Congress. When it wants to give it to the president, it knows how to do it and how to choose the right words in terms of how to do it. And in Justice Gorsuch's concurrence, he even has sort of a overture to the importance of the legislative process, that it is messy, that it is long, but that in the structure of our constitutional system, Congress's role is one that includes not only the power to tax, but the power to make laws, and that we as a country need to respect that. Even if it takes time, there is a value in that. So I see this court really vindicating Congress here, even at a time where Congress isn't doing much legislating on its own. Laura.
Right. We saw Congress push back here and there on specific tariffs that the president imposed, but the justices were saying essentially that if Congress wanted to expressly give this power to the president, they would have said so explicitly. Yes. And just so for the folks at home, when we say IEEPA, we're talking about the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which was passed in the 1970s. But Jeffrey, on what happens next, those questions that Jake laid out, what does happen now? Are these tariffs gone? Can the president impose other tariffs that he wants to? And what happens to the money?
He wasn't referencing the appellate ladder, the mundane but essential process of appealing a bad ruling to a higher court. He was talking about criminalizing the act of ruling against him, making it a prosecutable offense for a judge to sign an order that contradicts the will of Donald Trump. And the silence in that room, it was a sound that will echo through history books. Most of the Republican lawmakers present.
Well, that's the central question, and the answer isn't clear. For the tariffs that have already been paid, which is up to billions of dollars, individual importers have to sue one by one to get them back. And some have already filed lawsuits. Others will file them in the future, but that's going to be a messy and complicated process. The administration has said that it's going to try to reimpose tariffs under other authorities, other statutes, but they don't give the president as much flexibility as the emergency law does. So some of them may go forward and others may not. This is going to create tremendous uncertainty for investors, for consumers, and for international trade partners. Canada, for example, already says that most of its goods are not under tariffs, but it doesn't think that this decision will have a huge impact on the trade war with Canada. So although it's extraordinarily important and historic that the Supreme Court has asserted the separation of powers, has made clear that the president can't exercise authority that's granted to Congress, this will not by any means stop tariffs globally, nor will it definitively resolve how people can be reimbursed for tariffs that they've already paid.
So I guess we'll have to wait and see what other kinds of tariffs can stay in effect or that the administration may impose. But Henrietta, earlier this month, the Tax Foundation said Trump's tariffs cost the average household an extra $1,000 last year. And over the course of 2025, we saw items like coffee and tea go up almost 12%. One study found ground beef spiked 19%. So what does this mean? What does the decision mean for the average American when it comes to their pocketbooks?
The people whose institutional oath is to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic, said absolutely nothing. They absorbed this direct assault on a co-equal branch of government as if it were just another rant about crowd sizes or media bias. This is wild. This is not hyperbole. This is a genuine, documented, out-in-the-open attempt to use the legislative power of the United States Congress as a blunt instrument to bludgeon the judiciary into submission. And because the news cycle is a ravenous beast that consumes itself every 24 hours, this staggering moment was largely washed away by the next wave of controversies before it could fully penetrate the public consciousness. But the context surrounding this demand is what transforms it from a concerning outburst into a coherent and terrifying strategy. This demand for a judge punishment bill did not materialize in a vacuum. It arrived hot on the heels of a stinging, humiliating defeat at the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court, that marble temple of justice where Trump had meticulously placed 3 of his own ideological warriors, had just dropped a legal anvil on his signature economic policy. The sweeping global tariff scheme, the engine of his trade war ambitions, was ruled invalid. The vote was 6-3. It was not a nail-biter. It was not a narrow procedural punt. It was a definitive, unequivocal declaration that the president had overstepped his constitutional authority. The majority opinion, crafted with the kind of precision that leaves no room for future creative interpretation, stated clearly that the president does not possess the unilateral power to remake the global economic order using a vague emergency statute from the 1970s. This was the system working exactly as the framers designed it. The executive branch acted, the judicial branch reviewed. The judicial branch said, stop, that's not how this works. And for any president who accepted the fundamental premise of American governance, that would be the end of the road. You appeal, you lose, you pivot to a new legislative strategy. But for a president who has spent his entire public life operating under the assumption that rules are merely suggestions to be bulldozed, this ruling was not a legal check. It was an act of war. His response was immediate and venomous. He didn't hold a press conference to express disappointment while vowing to respect the court's decision. He took to his digital platform of choice and unloaded on his own appointees. The very justices whose confirmations he had celebrated as historic victories were suddenly reclassified as part of the weaponized, deep state apparatus. He accused the court of issuing bad and wrongful rulings. He painted the institution not as the neutral arbiter of the law, but as a political hit squad operating to undermine his agenda. This is the crucial psychological and political pivot. By redefining the judiciary as a political enemy, he is creating the moral and rhetorical justification for treating them as such. If they are not impartial guardians of the Constitution, but merely political actors in robes, then why should they be immune from political retaliation? Why shouldn't Congress, a political body, pass laws to punish these political actors? It is a closed loop of logic that is perfectly coherent if and only if you first accept the premise that the president is the sole legitimate arbiter of power. Once you accept that premise, anyone who says no to the president is not exercising their constitutional duty. They are committing an act of sabotage, and saboteurs in any system are criminals. Now here is where the story shifts from the president's offensive to the judiciary's defensive countermeasures, and this is the part of the narrative that has flown almost entirely under the radar. The federal judiciary is a famously reticent institution. Its power rests on its moral authority and the perception of impartiality. Federal judges generally do not hold press conferences. They do not issue fiery rebuttals to politicians. Their culture is one of monastic silence, letting the weight of their written opinions speak for themselves. So when the policy-making arm of the entire federal judiciary, the Judicial Conference, issued formal, written guidance stating that judges are now permitted to speak out in a measured defense of the courts against illegitimate forms of criticism and attacks that undermine judicial independence, that is the institutional equivalent of a fire alarm being pulled in a library. It is the sound of an institution that has been pushed to its breaking point. The guidance was universally interpreted by legal ethicists and court watchers as a direct green light for judges to push back against the specific targeted attacks emanating from the White House. The courts were telling their own members, the usual rules of silence no longer apply. You may defend the institution publicly because the institution is under a public assault unlike any we have seen. And then, as if to punctuate that internal memo with the force of a gavel, Chief Justice John Roberts stepped into the public square. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, a man who guards the institutional prestige of the court like a dragon guards gold, issued a stark and unambiguous warning. He said, publicly and on the record, that dangerous personal attacks on judges have got to stop. There was no nuance. There was no need to read between the lines. The target of the remark was as obvious as the sun in the midday sky. The Chief Justice, the head of the branch, was looking directly at the head of the executive branch and telling him that the intimidation campaign was unacceptable and dangerous to the Republic. That this moment did not dominate the national conversation for a solid week tells you everything you need to know about the state of our information ecosystem. We are so inundated with crises, so bombarded with outrages, that a direct constitutional warning from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to the President of the United States barely registers as a blip on the collective attention span. But this is not normal. This is a 5-alarm fire in the basement of the Capitol. Let's expand the aperture on this story because isolating it to just the domestic legal fight misses the larger, more frightening context. This war on the judiciary is not happening in a sterile vacuum of legal theory. It is happening against the backdrop of an escalating international posture that pushes the boundaries of both domestic and international law. The president has made public threats regarding conflict with Iran that have caused former military lawyers and JAG officers to issue stark warnings about potential war crimes. The language of civilization will die tonight, and the targeting of cultural or civilian infrastructure is not just bluster. It is the kind of rhetoric that, if acted upon, triggers legal obligations within the military chain of command. U.S. military personnel are trained and legally required to refuse unlawful orders. They are not automatons. They have a duty to the Constitution and to the Uniform Code of Military Justice that supersedes the orders of a superior if those orders are manifestly illegal. And this is where the two tracks of the story converge with the force of a head-on collision. The judges who would be asked to rule on the legality of those military actions, the legal advisors in the Justice Department and the Pentagon who would be asked to write the memos authorizing or constraining those actions. Those are the very people the president is actively trying to neutralize, intimidate, and criminalize right now. By branding judges as criminals, by demanding that Congress pass laws to punish rogue rulings, he is sending a very clear signal to every single person in the legal chain of command. The message is, if you tell me I can't do this, you are not a good lawyer or an impartial judge. You are an enemy criminal, and I will find a way to make you pay. It is a preemptive strike against the rule of law designed to clear the field of any potential objectors before the order to act is ever given. This is not a series of coincidental news items. This is a synchronized strategy. The tariff ruling proved that the courts are willing to limit his domestic power. The war threats signal that he intends to exercise unchecked power abroad. And the attacks on the judiciary are the bridge between those two realities, an effort to dismantle the domestic checkpoint so that the international highway is wide open. Let's pull this apart and examine the specific mechanics of what is being built. The president's theory of executive power is the foundation upon which this entire structure rests. He has articulated it plainly, repeatedly, and without apology. He believes Article 2 of the Constitution grants him the power to do whatever he wants as president. This is not a straw man argument, these are his own words. If you accept that constitutional premise, then the logic that follows is inexorable. If the president has unlimited power, then any judge who issues an order limiting that power is not acting within their constitutional role. They are acting outside of it. They are, by definition, an illegitimate obstacle. And if they are an illegitimate obstacle, they are a rogue. And if they persist in their obstruction, they are criminals. And criminals must be punished by new laws. This is the internal, coherent, and deeply un-American logic of the position. It is dangerous precisely because it is not insane gibberish. It is a fully formed alternative theory of government that has no place for an independent judiciary. In this worldview, the courts are not a check. They are a bug in the software of the state. And the president is demanding Congress send him the patch to delete them. The Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling on the tariffs is the most powerful evidence we have that this theory is not accepted by the constitutional system, even by the justices the president appointed. That is the part of this story that should give people pause before they descend into complete cynicism. Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, the living embodiments of the conservative legal movement's triumph, looked at the text of the law and the structure of the Constitution and said, no, the power you claim does not exist. They did not side with the man who put them on the bench. They sided with the document they swore to uphold. That is what an independent judiciary looks like in action. And the president's response to seeing that independence in action was to turn on them with a ferocity usually reserved for his political rivals. He called the institution they serve weaponized. He framed their decision not as a difference in legal interpretation, but as an act of bad faith. He is trying to reframe the act of judicial review itself as an act of corruption. And if you can convince enough people that judicial review is corruption, you can justify any measure taken to stop it. That is the end game. It is not about winning an appeal. It is about destroying the legitimacy of appeals altogether. The judiciary's response, therefore, is not a petty political squabble. It is an existential defense. When the Judicial Conference tells judges they can speak out, they are acknowledging that the traditional shield of silence is no longer sufficient. The attacks are not coming from fringe websites or late-night cable hosts. They are coming from the podium of the White House and the floor of Congress. When Chief Justice Roberts says the attacks have to stop, he is using the only tool he has left, the moral authority of his office. He cannot order the U.S. Marshals to arrest the president for contempt. He cannot defund the executive branch. He can only speak. And the fact that he felt compelled to speak, to break the tradition of judicial silence in such a direct and confrontational manner, is the clearest indication we have that the judiciary believes it is in a fight for its life. This is not a dispute over a legal doctrine. This is a dispute over whether there will be anyone left to interpret legal doctrines in the future. And we must return to the chilling silence on the question of war powers, because it is the shadow that gives this story its terrifying depth. The same lawmakers who might privately cheer the Supreme Court for checking executive overreach on trade are conspicuously absent when it comes to checking executive overreach on war. The Constitution could not be clearer. Congress declares war. The president commands the military. That line has been blurred for decades, but it has never been erased with the kind of explicit threats we are seeing now. The rhetoric about ending civilizations is not normal diplomatic language. It is the language of total war. And yet, the pushback from the legislative branch on this front is a whisper compared to the roar we heard on tariffs. Why? Because the political cost of opposing a president on national security is perceived to be higher than the cost of opposing him on economic policy. It is easier to vote against a tax on aluminum than it is to vote against a bombing campaign, even an unauthorized one. This disparity is the crack in the foundation of this institutional reawakening. The judiciary is standing up. The Senate stood up on trade. But will anyone stand up on war? That question is not theoretical. It is the next chapter of this story, and it will be written in real time as the pressure on Iran continues to build. The cycle we are trapped in is accelerating. A court issues a ruling that limits presidential power. The president escalates his rhetoric, labeling judges as criminal enemies of the state. The judiciary, feeling the pressure, issues more formal guidance and more public defenses. The president, seeing the pushback, escalates further, demanding more direct legislative tools to punish the judges. This is a feedback loop with only one logical destination, a direct constitutional collision where the executive branch openly refuses to comply with a binding federal court order. We are not there yet. The system is still holding, thanks in large part to the institutional integrity shown by the likes of Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett. But the trajectory is clear. The president is testing the fences. He is looking for the weak points. He is trying to normalize the idea that judges are just politicians in robes, and that if they rule against him, they are fair game for any and all retaliation. And the most dangerous part of this entire saga is that the institutions that are supposed to stop this, the media, the public, and most importantly, the Congress, are struggling to keep up. The outrage is diluted. The attention span is fractured. And in the gaps between our collective attention, the foundations of judicial independence are being chipped away, one insult, one threat, one demand for a crime bill at a time. This is the bottom line, and I need you to carry this with you as you navigate the rest of the news cycle. A sitting president of the United States is actively engaged in a campaign to criminalize the federal judiciary. He is doing this out loud in front of lawmakers and on social media. He is demanding that Congress pass laws to punish judges for rulings he does not like. He has attacked his own Supreme Court appointees after they ruled against his expansive claims of executive power. And he is doing all of this while simultaneously making threats on the international stage that legal experts warn would constitute grave breaches of international law. The federal judiciary, an institution designed to be quiet and reserved, has been forced into the open. They have issued new ethics rules empowering judges to defend themselves. The Chief Justice of the United States has issued a stark public warning that these attacks must cease. This is not a normal political fight. This is a war for the soul of the constitutional order. The question is no longer whether the president respects the courts. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests he does not. The question is whether the rest of the country, and specifically the United States Congress, has the institutional courage to ensure that the courts remain standing when the dust settles. The courts are doing their job. They are removing the legal foundation from under the president's most aggressive power grabs. And he cannot stand it. He cannot stand being told no by people he cannot fire. That is the source of his fury, and that fury is now aimed directly at the heart of the American rule of law. Stay tuned, because the next time we convene, we will be examining the precise mechanics of what happens when a president decides that a court order is just a piece of paper. That is the line we are approaching, and you need to know what tools remain to stop the country from crossing it.